Welcome to episode 27 of the Strategic Momentum Podcast. I'm your host, Connie Steele. Our guest today is Kevin Garton, Chief Operating Officer of Context Capital Partners. Throughout his career, Kevin has worked in organizations of every size, from Fortune 500 companies to small startups, and he's hung his hat across a variety of industries, from consumer products, internet media, financial services, to enterprise software. And along this journey, Kevin's learned that the heart of a strategy is making choices that enable you to be competitive or have a competitive advantage in the market that you decide to operate in, regardless of your organization's size or what industry you're in. So over the past year, he's used his expertise to help Context Capital Partners redefine their business strategy. And now it's time to put the right people in the right roles to make this new strategy happen. Kevin walks us through what it takes to develop a sound business strategy, and just as important, the misconceptions many people have around what a strategy actually is. The idea of creating a strategy may sound simple, even obvious, but as you'll learn in this episode, the choices you have to make almost never are. Thanks, Kevin, for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Connie. It's great to be here.
So I'd love for you to share your career journey and how that has resulted in where you are today, because you haven't really had a linear path.
That is correct. I have not had a linear path at all. I've actually been really lucky to work in, really large Fortune 500 companies like Procter & Gamble and Corning and Levi Strauss. I've also been really fortunate to work in, smaller firms and firms that are much more in the startup phase. It's kind of been interesting too, because I've had the opportunity to work across a lot of different industries. So I've been in consumer products, in packaged goods, apparel, toys. I've been in the internet media space. I've worked in the software industry, both on the consumer software side and the enterprise software side. And I've worked in financial services. So it's been a pretty interesting journey. The thing that I think is common though among all of those roles that I've had is I've always been customer facing. So it's given me great insight into how each industry worked and what was needed within each industry. And I think, the other thing that's been a kind of a common framework across what I've done is that I've always participated or wanted to participate in companies where there's a building role or where it's pursuing a growth opportunity. And I think what I've learned about myself is that I don't function particularly well in conservative environments or environments where there are large bureaucracies or environments where, it's more of a maintenance role. And I think a lot of people would probably say that, right? It almost sounds overly negative, but I think some people are really good in those roles and it's a valuable skill. It's just not one I'm particularly good at. So it's been a great journey. And again, I really learned that, my focus is on, desire to be in growth roles in entrepreneurial companies. And I think as I've kind of looked at different opportunities and changed what I've wanted to do in my career, that's been the common refrain and the thing that I've really enjoyed doing.
And you were the Chief Strategy Officer at your current company, but have now moved on to be the COO. So tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, it's kind of an interesting thing when you create a strategy and then you're asked to actually implement that strategy. So I spent the last 12 months at Context Capital Partners really help revising, what we're doing as a company, really from the ground up, completely kind of tooling the company, developing a new business model. So I spent the last 12 months doing that, almost acting as an internal consultant, independently working with all the leadership across the company and across multiple different businesses, and really put together a new strategy for the company. And then recently was asked, as we started to implement the strategy, part of the implementation is, getting the right people on the bus and getting the right people in the right roles. And it became kind of obvious and somewhat apparent that having the person who wrote the document implement it would be a good idea. So I've taken on the role of Chief Operating Officer recently and really responsible for implementing and building out the plan.
So certainly you understand what it takes to bring a strategy to life, because if you don't bridge the strategy and the execution, the reality is that great strategy, that vision will never pay off.
Yeah, that's right. There's an axiom that the best ideas are the ones that can be implemented. So there are lots of great ideas and great strategies and great programs out there, but if you can't implement them, they probably aren't really great So kind of bridging that strategy to execution. It's also something that I've focused on a lot in my career in terms of, developing, and I think it's critical, developing strategies that can actually be executed. So that's, it's been exciting, and we still have a lot of work to do, but looking forward to being on this, on the implementation side.
So given your experience, what do you think constitutes a compelling business strategy?
Well, I think at the core, strategy is about choice. And it's about the tough trade-offs you have to make around those choices. And it's really, the choices are really around your core assets. And that really tends to be the people in your organization, the time that you have, and the capital you have to deploy. There's also an element of managing, whatever core assets you might have, which, could be intellectual property. It might be proprietary capability. It might be other hard assets. But at the heart of it, strategy is really about making choice and making choices that enable you to be competitive or have a competitive advantage in the market that you decide to operate in.
Do you think there are myths and misconceptions on what people feel a strategy entails? Because your particular definition, I don't think is what many people may come up with.
Well, I think there are 3 or 4 kind of common mistakes that I think people make when they think about strategy. Sometimes it's people think strategy is a vision. And, a vision or a mission statement are really important, and they can be an important part of a strategy, but they really just provide the direction. They don't provide the detail that you need that encompasses, being able to develop a complete strategy and execute a strategy. I think the other mistake that people make is sometimes they refer to strategy as best practices. So they might say, we want to be the best at these 5 things. We want to have this ROI. We want to have this product development lifecycle. We want to have this customer acquisition cost. And those, aren't really, again, they're part of they might be part of a strategy, but they're not really the strategy itself. But I think the most common mistake that people make is they think of strategy as a plan. And the plan is really the tactics that you use to implement a strategy. So companies do this, most big companies do this, and a lot of small companies do this. They develop their annual plan and they spend, 3 or 4 months developing the plan, creating budgets. They're more often than not just kind of optimizing the status quo and not really thinking about how they pursue different businesses, how they go into different markets. Do they have the right business model? Are they in the right channels? And those are all, and, how many new, what kind of products do you want to develop, and making the choices between all those things, and, making the deliberate decision not to do some things. So I think more than the most common problem is people think of strategy as a plan, and a plan really is just the tactics that you use to implement the strategy.
So I think another thing in listening to what you just said, when people develop the plan, they can take a very narrow view on what the plan would encompass. So to your point, they're really not looking at the broader picture of the trade-offs between, what market should we go into, what's the right audience, and services and so forth. Because when you were talking about this, it was quite comprehensive. Why do you think people seem to struggle in being able to look at things in a very broad sense and understanding what those trade-offs need to be versus, I think at times, kind of going very narrow and deep?
Well, I think, one of the challenges that exists in lots of environments is there's nobody in the company is responsible for strategy specifically. It might be, the marketing department, it might be the CFO, it might be the CEO, but oftentimes there's not a function or a department or a group or a person responsible for strategy itself. It's a part-time job for somebody else that's trying to work on other things. And so I think that's one challenge. I think the other issue is that it's actually quite difficult because making those choices are hard. And what happens, I think, in a lot of environments is it's inherently easier to focus on plans and tactics. And in the short term, if you're doing lots of things, if you have lots of activity, if you can, check a lot of things off the daily task list, you feel like you're making progress, and you can show lots of minor wins. You're doing a really broad set of activities, but in fact, you're often not working on the vital few things that you need to do to create a differentiation in the marketplace. And it's really only when you make those tough choices where you can win. And tough choices force your hand, and they confine you to a path. And people, I think, are hesitant to be confined, but they also, when you make the right choices, they free you to focus on the things that really matter. And I think it's just, people have inherently a difficult time making choices, especially when it's not, 100% clear which direction to go in. And you just have to have a conviction and pursue that direction. And by that choice, you're choosing not to do other things, which I think, again, is very hard for people to get their heads around.
Well, I'm sure that there's this fear that happens when you make that choice. It feels locked and set in stone. And the concern that if they make the wrong choice versus doing what they've continued to do, and they might have had some success continuing to do what they've always done, that it could result in a less than desired outcome. Because it is scary about making those trade-offs. The other thing that I hear is that you have to think of it as being a marathon and not a sprint. And I think by human nature, a lot of us want to have those.
That's correct.
And by just doing things, doing activities, they may be perceived as wins versus really activities towards the right end goal and outcome.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it when you make the right choices, it really does free you up to focus on the things that really matter. There's a process that I started to deploy a couple years ago, which was really super helpful. It was essentially record the 5 things you want to get done every week and do the first one and don't go to the second one until you get the first one done. And it really helps you prioritize and focus on the things that are important. And I think you can almost think about strategy in that way as well, because it just is a process of helping you prioritize and make those choices. But it is, again, it's just much easier to do lots of activities and focus on lots of tasks. And it feels like you're getting something done, and it feels like you're making progress. But ultimately, I think people wake up after a year or two and realize that they're not necessarily winning, and they may be getting beaten by the competition, and they don't understand why, because they feel like they've done a lot, but they really haven't focused on the core things that allow them to win in the market.
To successfully develop a strategy, you have to understand what a strategy really entails. It's not a vision. While vision can be an important part of strategy, it only provides a direction. Strategy isn't a plan either. Rather, a plan is a set of tactics for implementing a strategy. And strategy, at the end of the day, is about choice and the trade-offs you have to make around those choices. As Kevin said, the choices you have to make are hard. It's just inherently easier to focus on plans and tactics. But to be successful and stay successful, you need a strategy. But what does it take to build it? So, how do you go about building the right strategy that is ultimately aligned to the business goals of the company, or really defining the strategy to determine the right business goals for the company?
The whole process starts with research and analysis, and that can go on for months, and it should go on for months. And I really think about it as a circular process. So you start with research, and you go to actions and implementation, but you have to come back to research, and that's where the analysis comes in, and that's where the iteration comes in. So it's just critical to have a system where you're gathering information, doing research, getting insight on an ongoing basis. There's not necessarily a secret sauce to it, but there are. I'm a firm believer in using processes and frameworks. I think they help create structure. They help people understand what you're trying to do. They also create alignment. But I think at the end of the day, it's just, strategy requires a lot of intellectual honesty, because just because you say you do something as a company or you write it as a goal doesn't necessarily mean you have the capability or the resources or the know-how to do that. It requires a lot of research and a lot of analysis, and it requires a lot of work. And it's exactly what you said earlier. It's a marathon. It requires a lot of iteration. And I think that's where sometimes, often executives don't have the patience to do that iteration. But there's rarely a strategy that's developed that is, it's written in a concrete slab and then it's used for the next 7 years. That just isn't the way this works. It's really about the process and iteration. But I believe in, using lots of frameworks and using lots of process. And there are lots of different types of processes out there, different frameworks. I like to use the SWOT analysis as a framework, strengths, weaknesses, opportunity, threat. I like to use the point of parity and point of difference model, which really helps you identify the things that you do that, enable you to participate or belong in a category and industry, and then the things that enable differentiation. So it's about having those frameworks. It's about making sure that people in the organization understand those frameworks and use them. And ultimately, you can almost think of it like a Venn diagram for a company. It's kind of the intersection of what you're passionate about as an entity, because you have to have passion to drive to the desired outcome. You have to decide what you want to be the best at, and I think that's always a great strategic question to ask your team. What do you want to be best at? What can we be the best at? And it's about how you make money. So it's almost a Venn diagram, and you can find that, that sweet spot in the middle, that intersection of passion, what you want to be best at, and how you can make money doing those things.
So when you think about developing strategy, would you agree that it's important to also ensure that you get a comprehensive viewpoint from various stakeholders across the organization? So it's not just an executive level exercise, but rather it's important to get the perspective of employees within the organization at every level. And in addition, getting the perspective from external partners or seeing what the marketplace has to say and what competition is doing as well.
Yeah, well, so that's a super, super important topic, and I've never implemented a strategy, whether it's been around a brand or a business or an industry or a market, without literally going and doing interviews. And I prefer to do lots of external interviews, so get a lot of outside input with customers, clients, peers. It's hard to get competitors to give you that kind of input, but get as much input externally as you can, because I use the statement that anybody inside the company is typically on the wrong side of the knowledge curve. So it's hard to be objective when you're on the inside. So get lots of external input and really formulate those into specific interviews. Write a set of interview questions, 10, 20, 30 questions, and literally go interview as many people as you can externally that would give you input into what you're trying to do, and then deploy that same process internally. Talk to employees at all levels. But I want to say one thing about this too. I think that what's really important around strategy is that it's top down and then bottom up. And I think that getting everybody's input is important, but the organization has to know that the executive team is dedicated to creating a strategy, building a new strategy, working on strategy. And I like to talk to salespeople, because salespeople are, generally the interface between the customer and the company and the industry. And they have, I think, excellent insight. They have, very specific kind of insight because what their role is in the company and what they're focused on. But it's really, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, in terms of your customers or your potential customers. I think in summary, get lots of input, lots of external input, and start top down, but go bottom up, because you're going to miss something if you only approach it from the entry level or the mid level or from the top level. You really need to get all throughout the organization.
So yes, it's so critical to get the point of view so that you're not looking at things from an inside out perspective. Because I also see that many organizations, when they develop their strategy, don't realize that their data and their input is biased, because they're only sort of interviewing or pulling data from what they know within their domain, versus truly having a market-facing perspective and pulling data from competition, from other customers, prospective customers, or market dynamics to really see what's happening out there in the marketplace.
Yeah, no, I think you can really think about it in terms of, outside in, inside out, top down, and bottom up. And it's really where you get the broadest set of perspectives. And it's really, the research and analysis phase is probably one of the, if not the most critical phase of the process. I think it probably is the most critical phase, because you can't really, you can't really make decisions if you don't have insight, and you need insight to be informed.
So how do you mitigate potentially the impatience of other leaders in the organization who are looking to get an answer quickly. You had talked about the importance of iterating, but the notion of being able to iterate on a strategy, I think is not something that a lot of people would be able to get their head wrapped around, because I think most may think, well, a strategy is somewhat a one and done.
One of the big challenges you have is just misalignment. And misalignment occurs when you have a different set of assumptions, when you have the wrong data. So we talked about how important data was before, and kind of the language that you use. So, every company has its own dictionary, and you need a common language and a common set of definitions. Strategy is really about creating alignment and making sure that you're communicating the process and the plan. And that's, when I talked earlier about having a process, it's just you have to share it with everybody. You have to make sure that they understand, what you're attempting to do and how the process is going to work and how they participate in the process and the timing of every aspect of the process. There's always pressure to do more sooner, faster. So it's I think really a lot about just setting expectations and having continual communication and having check-ins along the way. And, sometimes it's about, making a choice to get a win on the board if you need to do that to keep something moving forward. But I think it's really about the end of the process or at the end of the time frame. People understand, how the system works, how the machine works. And, again, it just goes to I think, constant communication.
So building a good strategy or a solid strategy, as you had indicated, really does require transparency throughout the organization and a clarity of communication on what you're doing and how the input and analysis ultimately ends in a kind of clarity of where the company will be going, of which will then be communicated again out to the organization. So people don't feel left in the dark, because I think some of the challenges too are that, many people don't fully understand their company's strategy. So they're not able to really execute on it because they don't quite understand where it came from.
Yeah, it's not something that you send a team off to go do for 6 weeks or 6 months in a dark room in the corner of the building, and they come out with some magical new element. I mean, strategy is a lot about methodology and creating a methodology that everybody in the company can follow and everybody understands. And you're exactly right. It inherently requires lots of collaboration and lots of transparency, because it goes back to the execution element. If people don't understand the strategy, they can't buy into the strategy, and it'll never be executed correctly or well. So it's critical that you have a lot of people participating, and that people understand what's happening along the way, and that they're getting input and they're giving you input along the way. And again, it goes back to process and methodology.
Strategy should be top down and then bottom up. You're going to miss something if you only approach it from a narrow perspective. You really need to get input from stakeholders throughout the organization and even outside of it. It's then necessary to establish that internal alignment by making sure you're communicating the process and the plan. Because if people don't understand it, they can't buy into the strategy, and it will never be executed well. And that's why you need a role like Kevin's, someone who is specifically responsible for strategy, with a holistic understanding of it, its impact, and the ability to communicate it. But wait, even after all that, you're still not done. You still have to analyze what you've learned and iterate.
So building a team and building again, a cross-functional team, because you get lots of good inputs, and give them that role. That's their role in terms of helping build a strategy. You invite them into the process so they are part of the iteration and part of the cycle. I think the other thing that I've used successfully in the past is pilots. So sometimes you may not know exactly how you want to pursue a business or a market or an opportunity or a product set, and so building a pilot, and it takes a bit of resources to do it. So it kind of depends on what you have available. But building pilots is a great way to iterate. You build something simple, small, deploy it in a controlled environment, see how it works. Do the research, do the testing, do the analysis. And that becomes part of the iteration and part of the input. But again, a lot of the iteration is just about bringing the teams in, getting good cross-functional teams, describing the role and the outcome that you're looking for from that team that informs, part of the strategic planning process. And then it just becomes an inherent natural part of what you're working on and what you're doing. And people start to, understand that how the iteration works. And that's why I often describe it as kind of a circular process, right? It's not linear. You don't start and end and, you never go back. You basically start, you deploy, you iterate. There's just one gigantic iteration if you think about it in that regard. So I think that's the important piece, is that it's a circular process.
Well, and in taking that kind of process and approach, you seem to be constantly thinking about, the big picture, but then also integrating what it takes to implement on that successfully so that you will ultimately reach your goal.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's really, when you think about, okay, the first step is research. The second step might be design and planning. The third step is feedback. The fourth step is implementation. The fifth step is analysis, and then analysis leads you right back into the first step on the research side. So it's really kind of going through that, that type of process and thinking, and just continuing to get inputs.
So what recommendations do you have for folks looking to sustain momentum as it relates to developing the right strategy for your business?
One of the most important things is to make sure that someone at your company is responsible for strategy. And if you have the opportunity, make that a role in the company, chief strategy officer, head of innovation, whatever the role might be called, but really assign somebody that job in the company. It's not a part-time job, and it's not a job that you should leave to a functional group who has a full-time job. So it's not a marketing job. It's not a finance job. It's not a business development. CEOs are ultimately responsible for strategy, but they're really accountable, but they can't be the driver. So you really need somebody, I think, in that role. So that, I think, would be number one. The other thing that, there are actually two really good books that I've read recently that have informed a lot of my thinking over the last couple of years that I would, definitely recommend to your audience. One is called Essentialism, and it's really about kind of getting down to the vital few things that matter. So it kind of ties right into thinking about strategy. The other one is Playing to Win, How Strategy Really Works. If you read those two books in combination with each other, I think it will really give people kind of a jump start. And both books have like defined methodologies on about how you go about doing this. And so over the course of my career, I've used a lot of the elements that are in both of those books, but they just capture them, I think, in a really unique and concrete way. So I think that would be the other thing that I would highly recommend to your audience.
And knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that I would have liked to have learned the concept of essentialism, about really defining and identifying the vital few. It just gives you such clarity. I was a victim of activity, like just do lots of activity, get a lot of things done, check a lot of boxes, create a long to-do list and get all those to-dos done. You feel really good about it. But I think the thing that I found to be, in my older life, just clarifying and freeing is really just working on one or two things. And make those one or two things the most important thing that you can do, and the things that will have the biggest impact. They're often, things that may take a little bit longer. But if you stay focused on kind of the vital few and, being an essentialist, it just kind of changed the way that I approach business and my personal life as well.
Great. And any last words of wisdom?
It's a lot of hard work. Developing, building, creating new strategies, but I think it's probably one of the most rewarding roles I've ever had in a company. And it's just stay focused, learn how to make choices, and good luck.
Great. And finally, what's the best way listeners can connect with you?
You can certainly reach me on LinkedIn, Kevin Garton at Context Capital Partners. You can also reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Kevin Garton.
Thanks so much for being on the show. Just awesome perspective on strategy and thinking about the implementation of it too.
Yeah, thanks, Connie. I really appreciate it. It was fun speaking with you today.
As Kevin shared with us, strategy requires a lot of intellectual honesty. Just because you say you do something as a company or write it as a goal doesn't necessarily mean you have the capability or the resources or the know-how to do that. It entails alignment within an organization and then making sure you're communicating the process and the plan. Because if your people don't understand the strategy, they can't buy into the strategy, and it will never be executed well. So it's critical to have somebody in your company responsible for driving the strategy and communicating it. Everybody needs a Kevin on their team. And after you have your Kevin, the process of creating that strategy starts with research and analysis. That can go on for months, and it should go on for months. Make sure to get that outside in, inside out, top down, and bottoms up perspective. Collect insight on an ongoing basis. Think of it as a circular process where you research, plan, get feedback, implement, and analyze your activity, which will lead you back to potentially needing to do more research. It's ultimately an iterative process, not a one and done. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can connect with Kevin on LinkedIn by searching his name or on Twitter under the handle @KevinGarten. You can also reach him via email at kevingarten@contextcapitalpartners.com. And if you've liked what you heard, please subscribe to the show on iTunes and leave us a review. This is what helps others find the podcast. You can also find us in the Google Play Store, Spotify, and Stitcher Radio. And if you want to hear previous episodes or get show notes from this episode, you can also visit us on our podcast page at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.